So welcome everyone to this second annual lecture on sexuality and gender in Europe. In this present edition, we have chosen homophobia in Europe as our research object. And we have invited two speakers, Professor Judit Takács from the Hungary Academy of Social Sciences and Professor Mol for the University of Central London. So I'm gonna really shortly explain the structure of this event, and then I'm gonna move on to give a short overview of the profile of our two speakers today. So really shortly, what we're gonna do is 35 to 40 minutes lectures for one each of the speakers. And then we're gonna move at the end when maybe 30, 20 minutes remain. We're gonna really briefly to exchange some opinions, maybe raise some questions in relation to those presentations. So I'm gonna introduce first Professor Judit Takács. As I said, she's from the Hungary Academy of Social Sciences. She is a sociologist. She has also studied as background though, history, literature, cultural anthropology, social sciences. So there's kind of an interdisciplinarity in her background. And her main research areas or interests are family roles, gender phobia, transphobia, homophobia, the impact of HIV/AIDS, and so on and so forth. And I would like to mention that previously in the past, she has been working with ILGA Europe, the biggest NGO organization, on the social exclusion of young lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transsexuals in Europe. On the other hand, we have Professor Mol, who comes from who is a professor of political sociology in the University of Central London. His background is also varied because he studied German and Russian in Scotland, and then later he went on England to study international relations at the University of Cambridge. From there, he developed a PhD thesis that analyzed the foreign policy of the Baltic states, taking into account the role of identity. And his research has been mainly focused on identity and power, and making special emphasis on sexuality and other social markers that intersect between each other. So in this sense, I would like to underscore the study, I think it's called queer, I don't remember right now. It's about queer migrants, I think in Berlin and London, that comprehensively analyzes the intersection between sexuality and asylum. So after this brief presentation, I shall give the floor to Professor Takács.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and I have prepared a few slides, so I will share this screen now. At least I will try. Let me see. So can you see my my screen? So today I will talk about homophobia and genderphobia in Hungary and well elsewhere, and I would like to devote this speech to the memory of Gert Hekma, who died yesterday, and I just got the news this morning. He was my professor at the University of Amsterdam. Just very shortly about myself. I'm actually a research professor, and I'm from the Center for Social Sciences in Hungary. And we were at one point part of the research network of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, but we are not any longer. Actually, I would, well, today, can you, sorry, I will start again because it seems that there is something wrong with my sharing. So let me see. No, it seems that I can't move. Can you see what I'm? Yeah. Oh, okay. So now it moves. Okay. So the structure of my presentation is the following. First, I would like to talk a bit about the terminology I will use. Then I will present very briefly some European and Hungarian empirical findings. And then I will talk mostly about the Hungarian gender-phobic, homophobic developments, policy and legislative developments. And then the end, well, probably I won't have too much time to address the last question, how to resist, but we can perhaps talk about this after Richard's talk in a bit more detail. So when we are talking about homophobia and gendered phobia, I thought we could ask what are we talking about exactly? And well, in 20th, especially in 20th century gay movements, when we are talking about those, they have been long criticized, especially, but not only in North America, for claiming equal rights on the basis of normalizing politics, presenting non-heterosexuals as potentially normal, gender conventional, good citizens. While since the 1990s, at least queer activists keep wondering what is happening to the right to be different. Trans activists often present similar arguments. For example, Ricky Wilkins saw these normalizing tendencies as being part of a new gay deal characterized by internalized gender phobia, referring to the strategic avoidance of addressing non-normative gender issues and norms in everyday life as well as in policy-making practices. Gender phobia, as I interpret this, is a fear of addressing and critically interrogating gendered differences and gender as a social construct. I interpret gender according to Under's definition, referring to aspects of masculinity, femininity, and gender diversity that are situated as socialized, learned, and cultural. And it may refer to one's internal sense of oneself, culture, roles, others' beliefs about oneself, structures and systems, and so on. The fear of gender is based on heteronormative and patriarchal dominant beliefs, which construe any opportunity to critically interrogate gender as disrupting dominant gender and sexual hierarchies. Broadly speaking, state institutions, regardless of political and geographical boundaries, are gendered and sexualized in that they historically and currently are structured on dominant gender and sexual norms, which reinforce male and heterosexual dominance. This is evidenced by state policies around the world, which have historically marginalized or negatively targeted women, as well as sexual and gender minorities, from discriminatory voting rights provisions and the criminalization of homosexuality to limiting reproductive rights, access to abortion, and marriage equality. Gender minorities continue to experience the gamut of discriminatory policies and in some cases outright targeting and violence by state officials. Even when the patriarchal and heteronormative power structures of the state remain firmly in place, states can react strongly to restrict or dismantle any attempts at critique and engagement around gender. Critical and public discourses around gender can challenge the state status quo, especially in political contexts characterized by plebiscitary authoritarianism or leader democracy, such as in Hungary, where the public sphere is firmly controlled by the state. Gender phobia can be seen as not only a more telling, but conceptually also broader and more neutral term than homophobia. Wikberg already in 2000 noted that in comparison to racism and sexism, homophobia is not a neutral category in the sense that in theory, any discrimination on the basis of race and sex could be seen as racist or sexist. Homophobia, on the other hand, designates homosexuals as its objects and victims. Even though, since the publication of George Weinberg's book on society and the healthy homosexual in 1972, it has become a widely shared idea that it is not homosexuality that is to be seen as a disease, but homophobia. And already a few years later, homophobia was proposed to be interpreted as only one of the dimensions constituting homonegativism, a larger multidimensional domain or catalog of anti-gay responses. This was done by Hudson and Ricketts in 1980. However, the term homophobia itself, operating with the notion of a specific new kind of phobia, that is the irrational fear of homosexuals, has been heavily criticized from the very beginning in the 1970s, for example, by Kent Plummer and Kitzinger as well, for being a misnomer, which will direct attention mainly on individual traits and neglect sociocultural contexts where hostility towards homosexuality can be deeply embedded. Homophobia can be defined as a specific subset of gender phobia, partly because social rejection of gays, lesbians, queers, and non-heteronormatively acting others seems to be part of a broader gender belief system characterized by heteronormatively appropriate and usually quite distinct paths of women and men in society. It is also a common experience that homophobia tends to go together not only with other social phobias like xenophobia, but also with traditional views regarding the roles of women and men in society. When I'm using the term homophobia in my work, I'm using it in an interpretational framework which is more intimately connected to heteronormativity than to the concept of homosexuality, carrying several denotations and connotations of behavior, identity, performance, and history. Thus, in this presentation, homophobia is interpreted not as a homosexual only issue, but as a broader one, which can affect lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and other people, rather than focusing on a specific individual level form of irrational fear, being largely disconnected from its specific sociocultural surroundings. It should be handled as an awareness-raising tool about heterosexist, heteronormative, heterosexist, heteronormative oppression operating in Europe. So when we are talking about this heteronormative oppression, I would say that it's very important that we turn to empirical findings, and of course we can do it in different ways. And today I will focus on social attitudes, but of course, later in my presentation I will also turn to policy developments and legislative developments. But there are other ways as well. So let's see, how social attitudes can reflect homophobia and genderphobia. We can, of course, in empirical social science, in the context of examining social attitudes, we are very much dependent on the available available variables, and here I have actually collected a few. The first attempt was done in 1981 within the European Value Studies and also the World Values survey, and this was about homosexuality, whether it can be always justified, never justified, or something in between. I mean, this is a big mystery for me, what it means exactly, this variable, what it refers to. It would be great to actually do some qualitative research on, on the interpretational framework of this variable, but well, perhaps one day we can do this. I haven't done it yet. Then it's quite interesting to see how these available variables developed. In 2006, for example, in the Eurobarometer, there was the first question or item about homosexual marriages. You can see here on the screen the actual variable, and this was not just homosexual marriages, but adoption of children. So the second one was adoption of children should be authorized for homosexual couples throughout Europe, and they had to express their agreement level with these statements about homosexual marriages and adoption of children by homosexual couples. Then, I turned to the European Social Survey, which I use very often because I think this is probably the highest quality available social scientific survey now in Europe. The European Social Survey was established in 2002, and since then, in every 2 years, we have the data collection rounds, and since already 2002, since the first round, there was a so-called gender acceptance question included, and it's a very simple one: gay men and lesbians should be free to live their own life as they wish. And in a footnote, they added that this freedom of lifestyle is meant as being free and or entitled to live as gays and lesbians. And therefore it's not about being imprisoned or not, as it was interpreted in few countries. We learned it from the ESS team. And for a long time, this was the only question or item available in the European Social Survey about social attitudes regarding gay men and lesbian women. But then in 2016, this was the 8th round of ESS, they introduced 2 more questions. The first one was if a close family member was gay or was a gay man or a lesbian, I would feel ashamed. And the other one was about adoption rights. Gay male and lesbian couples should have the same rights to adopt children as straight couples. And I would like to share with you now the, some a general overview of these 3 variables. Here you can see the actual number of answers according to the answer categories. The first one is strongly agree, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, strongly disagree, and then the last 2 or 3 categories are don't know, refuse to answer, and I think in another slide there's also missing values, or I don't know, not non-available, I think. So I just wanted to show you this slide about, this was the general acceptance question about gay men and lesbians should be free to live their own life as they wish. You can see that there are countries where there is a very clear agreement. For example, in Austria, Belgium, Germany, Spain, Ireland, the UK, France, and there are some countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, well, Hungary, Croatia, there, Bulgaria, where you see a different pattern of the answers. And of course here, I mean, these are, as I mentioned, these are actual number of numbers. I mean, these are not weighted in any way. So these are very the raw picture you can see here. But still, I thought that this might be interesting, and you will see the gender composition of the respondents as well. So these are the number of respondents according to the answer categories. And let's have a closer look at this. If a close family member was a gay man or a lesbian, sorry, I would feel ashamed. So here as well, we will see pretty similar patterns. I mean, those countries where there was a pretty high general acceptance level, you will see reflected in this in these results as well. And let's have a look at the third one, which is about adoption rights. And here you will see that perhaps the patterns are a bit different, or not so, not so so much similar to the first two. And I think we can have a look at then the mean values. That is the next slide. So here I prepared this slide on the basis of the 8th round and the 9th round. So this is 2016 and 2018 data. These are the most recent available data. And here you can see that in these last two data collection rounds, they are altogether, I think, around 25-30 countries. And of course, for example, Iceland didn't take part in the 9th round, and Russia either. But you can see that, well, Iceland was one of the most, well, open-minded country, if I can say such thing at all, according to these, according to this diagram. And so on the one hand, you see Iceland, the Netherlands, Sweden, Spain, and Norway. And on the other hand, you see Russia, Lithuania, Macedonia, Serbia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. So I thought that this could be an interesting overview. So I also, well, I mean, we also actually did some well, calculations, and we can here, what you can see is that this is well, these are just very simple linear regression models about on the basis of using data from 20 countries participating in both ESS rounds of both the 8th and the 9th ESS rounds. And you can see that we have prepared these models on the basis of all the three variables, which we already discussed. And well, we used those as dependent variables, and the independent variables were socio-demographic variables, attitude questions related to political views, statistics, satisfaction to democracy, immigrants, and well, this was done also with this Hungarian data. And actually, I won't go into too much details, but I can say that the conclusion was that actually, internationally, we can say that the four main predictors for the independent variables were attitudes towards immigration, religiosity, education, and the country of origin. And actually, in Hungary, in the Hungarian models, gender and religiosity were not significant, while attitudes towards immigration and self-placement on the left-right scale were the primary predictors. So that is, I just thought that I would give you this sort of empirical background information, because this probably helps to make sense of what is coming now, which is about the Hungarian developments. So we can say that during the last few years, there is a steady pattern of the Hungarian far-right populist governments implementing restrictive policies against LGBTIQ people. Using the concept of genderphobia, we can explore the legal developments of gender and sexuality restrictive policies and their practical implications in Hungary. It could be argued that these policies are caused by the rise of populism and illiberalism in Hungary, which rely on heteronormatively discursive formations of tradition, normality, and family. While it was already demonstrated by previous studies that the rhetoric of politicized and essentialized parenthood, as well as the need to defend the family, can effectively mobilize people in different European political contexts, what makes Hungary unique is how so much of this plays out at the policy level, not just symbolically or discursively. Act 79 of 2021 on harsher action against pedophile criminal perpetrators and the amendment of certain laws with a view to protecting children is often framed as the Child Protection Act by members and supporters of the Hungarian government, while others, especially NGOs representing the interest of LGBTIQ people, speak about it as the homosexual propaganda law. These Hungarian NGOs referred to the introduction of Act 79 as a Russian-style attack on freedom of speech and children's rights, pointing to the similarities between Act 79 and the Russian federal law banning propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships among minors, which was introduced in Russia on the federal level in 2013, but in a regional level it was introduced in certain Russian regions much earlier. In fact, the Hungarian Act 79 can be seen as the second Russian-style child protection measure within the European Union since the 2009 introduction of the Lithuanian law on the protection of minors against the detrimental effects of public information, prohibiting the direct dissemination to minors of public information, whereby homosexuals, bisexuals, or polygamous relations are promoted because it has a detrimental effect on the development of minors. This was a quote from the actual text of the law, of the Lithuanian law. Let's focus first on the rise of populism and illiberalism in Hungary and its impact on genderphobic policies. Growing populist rhetoric has been well examined in East Central Europe. However, it can be argued that while research on the rise of populism and illiberalism in Europe is growing, more attention to the real-world consequences of populist governance is still needed. In Hungary, with its deepening and accumulating democratic defects, the real-world consequences of paternalist populism have played out predominantly in the form of restrictive policies that work to harm and strip civil rights from various social minority groups, including the Roma, refugees, and LGBTIQ people. Similar to negative effects of populism on gay and lesbian rights, which have been documented elsewhere, radical reforms in Hungary's domestic policies under the leadership of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and his governments, which specifically target gender and sexuality, have been further bolstered hetero-nationalist and patriarchal principles. These policies, including Act 79, work to further enforce genderphobia in state institutions. The antecedents of Act 79 can be traced back to the early 2000s, when disillusionment with global capitalism became increasingly widespread. The 2008 economic crisis led to further tensions deriving from the perception that the EU's main goal is to facilitate capital accumulation for the European core countries by functioning as a post-colonial institutional structure dedicated to furthering the interest of West European transnational corporations by disciplining the semi-periphery, as austerity politics transferred decision-making from democratically elected member state institutions to bureaucratic institutions at the EU level. Efforts to address economic policies, gender equality, and sexual and minority rights in the EU were sidelined as democratic institutions across member states were weakened. The promotion of women's rights and LGBTIQ rights, once seen as a movement for liberal democracy and EU accession, became an affront to national sovereignty. Opposition to this movement was seen as patriotic resistance to EU dominance over Hungary's domestic policies. While Hungary joined the anti-gender scene relatively late, the political deployment of the concept of gender has accelerated in the past few years and is fiercely ongoing. Genderphobia would explicitly enter the political arena in 2010 with an anti-gender debate over a preschool curriculum amendment that requested teachers to deliberately avoid any strengthening of gender stereotypes and facilitate the dismantling of the prejudices concerning the social equality of genders. When the Fidesz government took office in 2010, they quickly removed this sentence from the amendment on the basis that addressing differentiation and inequality around the sexes was senseless. This was a strong indicator of what was to come. When the Fidesz government drafted a new constitution, the so-called fundamental law, which came into effect in 2012, it defined marriage as the union of a man and a woman and offered no explicit protection against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. The fundamental law also describes family as the basis of the survival of the nation and declares that the Hungarian government encourages the commitment to have children and protects families. Similar to other 21st century European political contexts, harnessing the emotional power of anti-genderism, family protection as a rhetoric tool has been continuously used by the Fidesz governments to try activating heteronormative parenthood as an attractive political identity. Beyond dramatically fueling the moral panic over the sexualization of children, this also entailed promoting and exploiting the view of the traditional family as a nexus of solidarity, the last frontier of social cohesion, a defense against rampant individualism and consumerism. Since then, there is increasing evidence of the intentional intertwining of heteronormativity, patriarchy, and reproduction in national rhetoric and policies in Orbán's system of national cooperation. Since 2010, and especially since 2019, previously gained LGBTIQ rights have been oppressively dismantled and further restrictions imposed. The long list of government actions systematically undermining the freedom and equal rights of sexual and gender minorities includes the introduction of paragraph 33 in a bill adopted in May 2020 that prohibits transgender and intersex people from having their gender legally recognized, the abolishment of the Equal Treatment Authority, which played an active role in the legal protection of LGBTIQ people, and the introduction of Act 79. As the government framed immigrants coming to Hungary from the Middle East and Africa as a national crisis in 2015-16, fences were erected along the country's southeast borders and increased border security enacted in order to stop asylum seekers. Instead of embracing immigration as a possible solution to population decline, Orbán, for example, in his regular weekly interviews on the state-owned Kossuth radio, railed against mixed populations and promoted the fear of Hungarians becoming a minority in their own country, as well as Christian Europeans becoming a minority in Europe. According to Orbán, a liberal Christian democracy strengthens families both externally through a firm anti-immigration stance that prevents population replacement, and internally by actively encouraging marriage-based reproduction of preferably white Christian middle-class citizens, rather than granting equal legal status to all existing varieties of families. Demographic decline is thus understood here primarily as the decline of the politically preferred population composition. This idea is not a new one in Hungary. Previously dominant forms of ethno-nationalist reproductive political ideas often pictured the undeserving Roma as a minority group producing children as a means of accessing child support benefits. The government's pro-natalist population policy package of 2019 included, well, I won't go into this now, but anyway, so anyway, connecting national policies to the protection of the heteronormative family and reproduction allowed the previous three and now the fourth consecutive Fidesz governments to enact stricter policies around family protection issues, including reproductive and LGBTIQ rights. In 2019, László Kövér, a Fidesz founding member and the Speaker of the Hungarian Parliament, compared same-sex couples' demand to be allowed to marry and adopt children to pedophilia, and added that a normal homosexual tries to adopt to this word without necessarily considering himself equal. It is here that the conflation of pedophilia and the rhetoric of child protection would become to further censor LGBTIQ content. The COVID-19 pandemic only added to the instrumentalization of anti-LGBTIQ policies with the implementation of state of emergency laws that enabled the government to rule by decree. This allowed sweeping gender-phobic policies to be put in place without formal democratic processes. In May 2020, the Hungarian parliament passed a law prohibiting legal gender recognition by prescribing sex at birth as a legally unalterable category. In December 2020, another law banned adoption by single parents, including gays and lesbians. According to this law, only married couples can adopt children, and exceptions can be granted only on a case-by-case basis by the minister responsible for family affairs. This was followed by the parliament adopting the 9th Amendment to the Hungarian Fundamental Law, which in fact includes a series of amendments declaring, among other things, that Hungary shall protect the right of children to their identity aligning with their sex by birth, and shall ensure an upbringing in accordance with the values based on our homeland's constitutional identity and Christian culture. Act 79 amended several laws, most importantly banning any advertisements or media contents that promote or portray deviation from gender identity aligning with birth at sex, gender reassignment, or homosexuality. It is made clear in the explanatory report to Act 79 that a lot of provisions are aimed at preventing LGBTIQ NGOs and other persons and organizations that might attempt to sensitize students in relation to the issue of non-discrimination from having access to educational institutions. Condemnation of Act 79 began immediately after it was voted into law, both domestically and internationally. On June 15, 2021, the European Commission announced that it was starting legal action against Hungary in relation to Act 79 on the basis of the violation of a number of legal norms, including the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, the E-Commerce Directive, the Single Market Transparency Directive, and the GDPR. Most importantly, in the Commission's view, the Hungarian provisions, and here I quote, violate human dignity, freedom of expression and information, the right to respect of private life, as well as the right to non-discrimination as enshrined, respectively, in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. Because of the gravity of these violations, the contested provisions also violate the values laid down in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. On the 21st of July 2021, the Hungarian government responded to the attacks from Brussels by following populist and genderphobic rhetoric, initiating a child protection referendum on questions such as, do you support the holding of presentations in public education institutions to introduce minors to topics on sexual orientation without the authorization of their parents? And here you can read the other three questions of the referendum. Much as the government framed immigrants coming to Hungary from the Middle East and Africa as a national crisis in 2015-16, and used this frame Hungary as protecting its citizens from destructive EU immigration policies, protecting children from LGBTIQ influence has become an us, Hungarians versus them, the EU battle, framing Act 79 as protecting children from persons and organizations offering sexual and gender education, and in turn promoting homosexuality and influencing the normal, that is cis heteronormative sexual and gender development of children, allows the Orbán regime to create policies which are purposely obscure and at the same time incredibly threatening. International legal experts have argued that the terms used in Act 79, such as propagation, portrayal, negatively influence, and homosexuality are too ambiguous to reach the standard of foreseeability, and that the provisions do not sufficiently define the circumstances in which they are applied. Well, I mean, now the government successfully had this referendum. I mean, successfully in the sense that we had this referendum at the same day of at the same time of the national elections. But we can say that of course, I can mention that the Hungarian legislation at the time when it was announced did not allow holding a referendum on the same day as the general elections, but this was changed as well. They changed the law, so this also allowed the referendum questions to become main topics of the election campaign. Well, actually, the referendum failed in the sense that it was invalid but still there were a lot of well, people voting, agreed, let's put it this way, with the ideas of the government, and knowing from previous experience, this will be used later by the Hungarian government to further, promote its homophobic and genderphobic agenda, I'm afraid. So at this point, I will stop, because I'm afraid I have run out of time already. So perhaps we can continue afterwards, after Richard's presentation. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing when I can. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Takács. So I think now it's time for Professor Moll to present his lecture.
Okay. Can you all see my slides? Yep, good. So thank you very much for inviting me today. It's a great pleasure. It would have been even more of a pleasure to be with you face to face in Barcelona, but maybe another time. So following on from Judith's excellent lecture, my talk will also look at social and political attitudes towards LGBT people in a post-communist state, namely Poland. But my lecture will focus more on the impact of identity, particularly national identity, on debates about the position of LGBTQ people in Polish society, and in particular how these debates have been weaponized by right-wing populist politicians in Poland. So what I want to do today is to start by looking at the immediate post-communist period and how homosexuality was constructed. Then really sort of bring the focus much closer to now and look at a number of anti-LGBT positions by politicians in contemporary Poland. Then I want to sort of spend some time looking at the reasons for these anti-LGBT positions. I want to start by looking at the reasons they say they're opposing homosexuality, and then I'll explain what I think the reasons they really oppose homosexuality, because they are not the same in my view. And then finally, I'll look at sort of international responses to this sort of anti-LGBT rhetoric and behavior, and then close with some queer responses within and across Poland's borders. So I want to sort of start in 1989, because in many ways, 1989 marked a watershed in the lives of queer Polish people. Poland was unique, I think, in Central and Eastern Europe in that homosexuality wasn't criminalized during the communist era. But nevertheless, homosexuality was presented as a form of Western depravity and as something that was inconsistent with socialist morality. Homosexuals were frequently kept under observation by the civic militia or by the security services, and an individual's homosexuality became of interest to the militia or the security services if this could be used as a means of recruiting them or to sort of blackmail them to sort of take part in sort of spying operations. And so this was sort of known as Operation Hyacinth, Akcja Hyacinth. Now, if any of you speak Polish, I would recommend this very good book here by Tomasik. If you don't speak Polish, then there's a very good book in English by Łukasz Schulz, which also looks at the communist period. Or if you have a subscription to Netflix, you can watch this very good film, a Polish film called Operation Hyacinth, which is a drama, but it's set against the backdrop of the anti-LGBT campaigns in communist Poland. So after 1989, Polish gays and lesbians had far less to fear from the police and other state authorities. Gay and lesbian venues were open throughout the country, at least in the larger cities, and magazines aimed specifically at LGBTQ individuals were launched. However, the long hoped for liberation for gays and lesbians soon came into conflict with attempts by the state and society to redefine Polish identity after 50 years of communist rule. So the collapse of communism in Poland, as in elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe, triggered a process of unparalleled social, economic, and political upheaval. You can sort of see the sort of inflation shot up immediately after the collapse of communism. Unemployment shot up from sort of practically 0 to sort of 15% within just a couple of years, and then fluctuated up and down over the next decade. The Soviet-style economic system had to be completely dismantled, and new political and economic institutions had to be rebuilt from scratch. So it was a period of sort of psychological upheaval. Equally importantly, a new cognitive framework had to be found through which citizens could make sense of the world around them and guide their decisions about who to trust and with whom to cooperate. Whatever Poles thought about communism, it did at least have very clear answers to questions about right and wrong, about friends and enemies. But when communism collapsed, these certainties disappeared. So people looked elsewhere for answers, and religion and nationalism both filled this ideological vacuum. Because both religion and nationalism offer a credible explanation of the past and a guide to the present and the future, and thereby provided a sense of cohesion and a sense of stability. And in many cases, it was the past that served as the guide for the present and the future. In rejecting the hated communist era, Polish political elites after 1989 harked back to the interwar period, the interwar republic, and its traditional norms and values. As this period was held up as the opposite of the abnormal communist era, tradition became equated with normal, with traditional gender and sexual roles seen as an important aspect of the nostalgia for normality. However, what was seen as normal was defined strictly in national, Catholic, and heterosexual terms. And in the Polish concept, these three concepts are largely understood to be indivisible. To be Polish means to be Catholic and heterosexual. So in the search for stability, therefore, any form of diversity, be it ethnic, religious, or sexual, can seem threatening. In Poland, as in much of Central and Eastern Europe, there was thus a tendency among individuals disoriented by the social, economic, and political changes to cling to traditional gender roles and sexual norms and emphasize absolute rules in an attempt to maximize predictability in an uncertain world. While most political institutions in Poland were weakened by the collapse of communism, one institution which emerged stronger after 1989 was the Polish Catholic Church. Having acted as the de facto political opposition to the Polish Communist Party throughout the communist period, and following the election of John Paul II to the papacy in 1978, the Catholic Church acquired enhanced legitimacy and political power after 1989. Acting as the ultimate arbiter of national values, particularly with reference to issues of gender and sexuality. While intellectual debates about sexual orientation did appear in the 1990s in Catholic journals, they did not stray far from the position set out in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, namely that same-sex acts are sinful in that they close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a genuine, effective, and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can they be approved. But far from restricting its views to the pulpit, the Church actively lobbied successive governments in the 1990s to ensure that their position on issues relating to sexuality was in line with Catholic dogma. According to the former MP Robert Biedron, the Catholic Church succeeded, for example, in ensuring that there was no reference to sexual orientation in the non-discrimination clause of the Polish constitution. So these factors combined to produce a hostile environment for queer Poles. So when Poland joined the European Union in 2004, it was hoped that this would improve the situation for queer people in Poland. But in some ways, it actually made it worse, as it led to an intensification of political debate about the place of LGBTQ people in Polish society. Given the EU's introduction of various measures aimed at promoting the legal equality of sexual minorities, including the incorporation of sexual orientation into the equalities agenda, and the requirement that member states ban sexual orientation discrimination in employment, nationalist politicians in Poland presented the EU's more liberal position towards LGBTQ rights as a threat to Polish values. And in the run-up to the 2005 parliamentary elections, nationalists and populist parties used the issue of LGBT rights to draw a boundary between the decadent West and the traditional East, with attitudes towards sexuality in Poland becoming a reference point for political self-definition and national pride. While homosexuality could perhaps be tolerated in private, there were various attempts to clamp down on manifestations of homosexuality in the public sphere, with pride marches a particular target. In the summer of 2005, Lech Kaczynski, who was the mayor of Moscow at the time, refused to issue a permit for an equality parade on the grounds that it was obscene and would upset the feelings of the religious. The march went ahead anyway, and participants were attacked by members of the All Polish Youth, a right-wing nationalist organization, which itself was given permission by Kaczynski to hold a normality parade a week after the equality parade. The influence of religion on Polish politics became even more pronounced in October 2005, following the election of the Law and Justice Party, led by Jarosław Kaczyński, the brother of the mayor of Warsaw. The coalition between the Law and Justice Party and its coalition partners, the Self-Defense and the League of Polish Families, embraced an ultra-Catholic and highly nationalist political agenda. The coalition came to power in part on a campaign to protect Polish national values from the perceived secular and liberal principles of the European Union. The perception in Poland of a marked cleavage between Polish and European values was strengthened by the publication by the European Parliament of 3 resolutions in which Poland was either implicitly or quite explicitly criticized for its failure to respect the rights of its LGBT citizens. The tone of the resolutions was interpreted in Poland as being highly patronizing and resulted in a feeling of wounded national pride and a backlash against both the EU and the promotion of LGBT rights, the two now seen as being inextricably linked. Following criticism from the European Parliament, therefore, it became a matter of national sovereignty that Poland be allowed to criticize sexual minorities, with homophobia thereby becoming a new voice of patriotism. So the outcome of this politicization of homophobia, in tandem with the negative rhetoric from the church and stereotypical portrayals of LGBT people in the media, was an environment in which homophobic attitudes dominated and many queer Poles faced discrimination, verbal abuse, and physical violence. More recently, in July 2019, the Polish city of Białystok held its first ever equality parade. What was meant to be a public demonstration of support for sexual diversity quickly descended into violence, with thousands of far-right protesters throwing rocks and bottles at the marchers while chanting God, honor, and motherland. As we've discussed, attackers were clearly motivated by both religion and by the nation, appeals which chimed with public proclamations by representatives of the Polish Catholic Church and the ruling Law and Justice Party. On the day of the march, the Archbishop of Białystok called upon the city's residents to defend Catholic values by attending a family picnic in one of the parks. While in the run-up to the European Parliament elections a few months earlier, Jarosław Kaczyński, the leader of the governing Law and Justice Party, referred to the LGBTQ rights movement as a foreign import that threatens the Polish nation. In the Polish presidential election in 2020, Andrzej Duda made the fight against so-called LGBT ideology a central plank of his campaign. At one meeting, he said that his parents' generation had struggled against communist ideology for 40 years, and they didn't fight for this so that a new ideology would appear that is even more destructive. They try to tell us that LGBT are people, but it's an ideology. And so if you sort of look at some of the images that were sort of disseminated during the campaign, you can see that they're sort of modeled on some sort of Soviet communist images. So on the left, this is a poster which says "Будь бдительным," be vigilant. And there you're seeing the arm representing the communist state clamping down on an unnamed enemy, which is threatening sort of communist society. And then on the right, you can see that the sleeve has been sort of modified to reflect Polish colors of the Polish flag, red and white. And the enemy is now sort of clearly defined in terms of LGBT ideology, which is threatening the sort of the Polish family, the sort of heteronormative Polish family with a mother, father, and 2 children. So clearly Poland is intervening to stop this new ideology from attacking Polish values. And then one consequence of this framing of homosexuality was the creation of LGBT-free zones across Poland. So over 100 municipalities, counties, and provinces, although you can see particularly concentrated in the southeast of the country, declared that they were LGBT-free. Now, clearly there was didn't have any sort of legal sort of impact, but nevertheless it sort of constructed LGBT people as sort of second-class citizens, and it also sort of legitimated sort of discrimination, violence against them. So why do Polish politicians, Polish populist, right-wing politicians take a position so strongly against LGBT equality and against homosexuality more broadly? So I would suggest that Polish populist politicians seek to legitimize their homophobia by arguing that they're seeking to protect the nation and its main building block, the traditional family, from the negative effects of homosexuality. Now, the first thing to make clear when discussing the relationship between the nation and homosexuality is that there is no a priori relationship between the nation and homosexuality. It's perfectly possible for individuals for whom membership of the nation is an important part of their self-definition to be fully accepting of gays and lesbians. However, history has shown that those who understand the nation to be a natural phenomenon growing out of extended kin groups are more likely to support patriarchal gender order and absolute rules on sexuality, and are thus more likely to oppose homosexuality. So I would say that there are 4 key threats that homosexuals are believed to pose to the nation. Firstly, gays and lesbians fail to contribute to its biological reproduction. Secondly, they fail to contribute to its cultural reproduction, so passing on language, norms, values, etc. They fail to adhere to national stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. And they deviate from shared national norms, especially those from religious teaching, as we've sort of discussed with reference to the Polish Catholic Church. So for nationalists, the biological and cultural reproduction of the nation is maintained by means of the patriarchal family, underpinned by heteronormative and patriarchal conceptions of masculinity and femininity. The most important role that a woman can play in the nation is that of the mother, producing sons and daughters for the nation and teaching them the ethnic language and culture, while men act as its defenders and decision makers. As the focus on the biological reproduction of the nation presupposes it to be heterosexual, gays and lesbians, by not having children, undermine the idea of the nation as a unified collectivity with a communal future. Even if one can sort of demonstrate that it's perfectly possible for sort of gays and lesbians to have children, they're nevertheless sort of represented as sort of being the wrong kind of families that are being created. They're not sort of the traditional families that the nation needs. Furthermore, stereotypes of gay men as weak and effeminate and lesbians as strong and masculine confuses the patriarchal gender order and the public and private roles of men and women central to most ethno-national discourses. As Jarosław Kaczyński put it, this threat, by which he means homosexuality, is an attack on the family. At all times, the natural identities of boys and girls are to be questioned. the whole mechanism of preparing children for the future roles of mother and father is to be destroyed. So this is why they say they're against LGBT equality, but I would argue that there are other factors at play. So firstly, we need to understand the timing of the introduction of anti-LGBT laws. Politicians tend to attack the LGBT community when their own positions are under threat. If politicians are beginning to lose popular support, they need to find a new way to legitimize their rule, i.e. they need to offer voters a new reason for them to vote for them. This is particularly clear in Russia. So the anti-LGBT law was introduced in 2013, but in 2012, you saw mass protests against what was seen to be the falsified elections of the Russian parliamentary to the Russian parliament. And this was the first time there'd been sort of mass demonstrations against Putin's rule, and therefore he needed to sort of find a way to sort of re-legitimize his power. Similarly, Viktor Orban introduced the equivalent sort of anti-LGBT legislation at a point when his popularity was sort of waning as a result of his management or mismanagement of COVID. At one point, I think Hungary had the second highest rate of COVID in the world after Peru. So the timing is sort of very important. If Mr. Orban thought that LGBT people posed a threat to the Hungarian population, then why wait for 10 years to do something about it? He'd been in power for over a decade. So clearly, if we sort of look at the timing of the introduction of these laws, they very usually follow periods in which the politician in question believes their position to be under threat. Sadly, in both cases, the position of Mr. Putin and Mr. Orban turned out not to be under threat. Furthermore, if they need to divert public attention away from economic and political problems, they often look for scapegoats. This is sort of common across Europe and the world. In Central and Eastern Europe, refugees previously played this role, but they're no longer as effective as they once were, and so a new scapegoat in the LGBT community had to be found. Now, choosing to scapegoat the queer community makes political sense for a number of reasons. Firstly, attacking homosexuality allows politicians to shore up support among their conservative voters by claiming to protect traditional values from the spread of Western liberal ideas. Secondly, as LGBT individuals are more visible and homosexuality more accepted in many Western states, it's easy for populists in Central and Eastern Europe to argue that homosexuality is something specifically Western, and that acceptance of homosexuality is being forced on their society from the outside. You sort of hear this from populist politicians across the region. One sort of a Latvian populist politician argued that they didn't have any homosexuality in Latvia until Latvia joined the European Union in 2004. Having done fieldwork for my PhD in the 1990s, I can show that that was not the case. There was plenty of homosexuality in Riga in the 1990s. So because they argue that it's particularly Western phenomenon, homosexuality and support for homosexuality, that it's being forced on them, that it's sort of un-Polish, un-Hungarian, un-Russian, therefore it's legitimate for politicians in their countries to restrict the rights of LGBT people and to legislate against this so-called foreign ideology. In addition, a support for LGBT equality is considered to be a specifically liberal value. Attacking homosexuality is also a useful way to delegitimize liberal politics in general. So even if more liberal politicians in the state are not specifically advocates of gay rights, the association between homosexuality and liberalism is enough to discredit liberal policies more generally. Also, despite the fact that research shows that homosexuals are no more prone to be pedophiles than heterosexuals, conflating homosexuality with pedophilia, as homophobic laws and rhetoric in Central and Eastern Europe either implicitly or sometimes quite explicitly does, this makes it a very effective means of generating support, as the desire to protect children is innate in all of us. Conflating homosexuality and pedophilia also makes it less likely that people will criticize anti-LGBT legislation for fear of being implicitly to support pedophilia. So finally, I'd like to sort of look at some responses to the sort of anti-LGBT rhetoric and behavior in Poland. So sort of start by sort of looking at some international responses, particularly from the European Union. So despite the fact that in the past, Poland has undermined the rule of law, sought to exercise tight control over the judiciary and education, and has contravened international refugee law with limited pushback from other states of the European Union, the introduction of the LGBT free zones provoked sharp criticism from the Commission and the leaders of other EU member states. As a result, the EU withheld funds from Polish municipalities that had introduced these LGBT free zones. Now, while Western criticism of these various homophobic laws is commendable, this strategy could end up playing into the hands of populist politicians like President Duda, in that this, again, he can show, look, this is sort of being forced on us from outside. The support for LGBT rights is clearly a Western phenomenon, and clearly we need to stand up in this battle between corrupt Western liberal elites and the pure Polish nation. So a better response, I think, comes from sort of queer Polish people themselves. And in Poland, initially, a lot of the response was sort of for LGBT rights was framed as a human rights issue or a Europeanization issue. But over time, activists in Poland have moved away from these framings because it grants too much responsibility for sort of adjudicating whether these rights have been achieved to sort of the international community, which again sort of feeds into this discourse about homosexuality being something Western. So queer activists in Poland for about sort of the past 10, 15 years have sought to reframe support for LGBT equality from being a universal human right to an issue sort of more rooted in the sort of the politics of being Polish. So activists at various LGBT equality parades in Poland have started using the Polish flag, as this photograph shows, in a bid to sort of reclaim national identity for sexual minorities. So not to allow Polish national identity, Polish norms and values to be determined solely by right-wing politicians and nationalist politicians. Furthermore, the 2007 Equality Parade in Warsaw, they chose Love Thy Neighbor as the theme for the parade, as a way to sort of resonate with Catholic values, to sort of argue that you can be sort of queer, Polish and Catholic. And then finally, and so by sort of doing that, sort of reframing queerness in Polish terms with reference to Polish culture and values, this makes it more difficult for populist politicians such as President Duda to argue that homosexuality is un-Polish. And then finally, since Poland joined the European Union, there's been a sort of considerable outward migration by queer Poles. And there is now sort of sizable Polish queer communities in cities like Berlin, London, Amsterdam, and they sort of work with sort of activists, use the resources available to sort of activists in these countries to plan sort of activist activities alongside activists in Poland themselves. Doing activism in certain Central and East European countries is sort of difficult, particularly in countries such as Russia and Hungary, where they now have these sort of gay propaganda laws, whereby sort of even sort of making simple statements in favor of LGBT equality could be seen as being illegal in contravention of these sort of gay propaganda laws. So the queer diasporas, the sort of Hungarian, Russian, Polish, outside of their home countries are sort of playing a sort of an important role in sort of activism to support LGBTQ people in their home countries. And that's where I will end today. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Professor Mo, for your presentation. I think now it's time that if any of you wants to comment the presentation of the other, or I can even like ask you a question about some aspects of representation, please go on. And I encourage the rest of the audience to do the same. So for starters, maybe I would like to ask Professor Takács. I wanted to ask you about populism, the relationship between populism and homophobia once again, because I think that perhaps it is true that in Eastern Europe, populism is linked with homophobia, but outside of it, in Western Europe, for instance, I don't think the relationship is that clear, in the sense that we have, for example, in the Netherlands, this right-wing populism that is progressive with gays and lesbians who are normative, but goes against the other who is foreigner, right? So I would like maybe you to elaborate a little bit on this conception of homonationalism that has appeared in the recent years. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Sorry. So your question is about populism, whether, you know, it has, well, of course, I mean, there are different types of populism, and in Hungary, we are enjoying the illiberal form of populism, and this is not very lucky combination for LGBTIQ people. And of course, I mean, as you mentioned, in the Netherlands, there used to be this, you know, like some famous or infamous figures who combined quite successfully, I would say, populism in this pro-homosexual agenda, but that wasn't a very lengthy, you know, political career, if I remember correctly. So it seems that you know, especially illiberal populist leaders could use homophobia and genderphobia more as fueling their actions than the other way around. And of course, I mean, this is a very it's a quite interesting question, you know, how, for example, in these illiberal populist context, homo nationalism and heteronationalism would be, you know, interpreted. And I mean, in this at this point, I would like to just where is it, very quickly, if possible. Where is it? Sorry. Yeah. Just draw your attention to our new book, which is this. I don't know whether, yeah. I'm sharing this, right? I mean, this paradoxical right-wing sexual politics in Europe. This is our new book, and here, you know, we are. We have discussed a lot of these issues. Especially, I would like to draw your attention to the French-Swedish comparison by Eva Reimers and Cornelia Moser, but also, we have, you know, a chapter on Hungary and and Ireland. So I would say, you know, there are a lot of things going on in this context nowadays, and yeah, it's unfortunately in these countries like Hungary and Poland, we are witnessing this very specific form of illiberal populism, which I mean, also we can, I mean, I'm not a political scientist, but obviously I'm following my colleagues' interpretations, and there are so many, you know, ways to interpret, you know, what is it, what we are having here? Is it, you know, it's a hybrid regime in which way? And I don't know, perhaps Richard can, you know, like, say something about this, because it's really also I'm afraid I'm part of this. You know, I'm Hungarian, and I live in the middle of these political discourses, and sometimes it's especially, you know, we are just a few weeks after the national elections, so we are still under the well, influence of the results, let's put it this way, and we will remain so for the next at least 4 years. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if Professor Moll wants to add anything on this.
Yeah, I mean, populist politicians will use whatever strategies they think will work, and so, I mean, as I hoped I showed in my presentation, sort of negative attitudes towards homosexuality in Poland predated the rise of the populist politicians. And so it sort of makes it much easier for them to sort of tap into this sort of negative attitude. Whereas perhaps in Hungary, the fact that the referendum failed shows that it's not going to be such a successful strategy, because social attitudes towards LGBT people may be better. I mean, I think the first gay pride in Central and Eastern Europe was in Hungary, if I remember correctly. So as you sort of pointed out, it's not just sort of East-West. Certainly in sort of Western Europe's, they also sort of weaponize homosexuality, but as you pointed out, it's for sort of homo nationalist purposes. You know, vote for us and we'll protect you from the Muslims who are the real threats to you. That sort of discourse. And yet in other countries, like in the Czech Republic, which have had equally sort of populist political leaders, homophobia isn't really a sort of an issue. Politicians there don't use it so much, because they know that the society is sort of much more, well, at least neutral towards sort of LGBT issues than is the case elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe. So instead, they know that Czechs are less tolerant towards Muslims, and so that's sort of what the populists in the Czech Republic focus on. But I mean, all populist politicians, they want to sort of limit the sort of the group of people who are legitimate in terms of their sort of opinions, their views, and so it's only the real Poles, the pure Poles, that we need to sort of take into consideration. And so ethnic minorities, they're not real Poles. Gay people, they're not real Poles either. If you're an atheist, then you're not a real Pole. So they're sort of trying to sort of make the sort of the group smaller and smaller, whose views they have to take into consideration, and then they can ignore everybody else's.
Thank you. Do you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to add about the Czechs that they are famously non-religious as well. So that's, you know,
yes,
that's also an important aspect.
Yeah, so I think it's about a set of elements that condition the opportunity structure of LGBT movements to act, right? So it's like a set of ideas, actors, and so on. We have a question from Marina.
Thank you very much for both of you. Sorry, I just forgot to turn on. Thank you very much for both of you. Actually, I was going to ask exactly the same question about populism. I'm studying populism. I'm a first year student of PhD, And I think, well, populism as it is, it's difficult to give it a description because it's still like, right? And so, but the most common one is that populism is a thin ideology saying that there is a common ground to hate. So they are the pure ones, let's put it that way, and then they are the other ones who actually make the whole thing horrible, and that are the ones attacking us. The common man, the general will is one of the characteristics of populism. And I think populism can be actually taken in different perspective. For example, homophobia obviously would be the right wing populist saying, yes, it comes from Western. I think it's, I thought it was very interesting was, I don't remember who of you two, but I think it was Richard who actually said something about being, let me take that. These are, I got lost. Just take some notes and then I completely forgot through them. But well, it was about that the populism in homophobia means that there's a few ones and then the other ones, and the Western cultures are invading what we have in Poland, for example. I think it was Richard talking about that. There's exactly the same strategy that all populists use, but that is the whole thing. What I was, I have two questions. One is more about something more, more detail. It was from Judit. You said, actually, I was shocked that well, not referendums, but are there any laws in Hungary that against holding two voting ballots? Because you said that in one of the days, at the same day, they could hold a referendum and also I forgot, a referendum at the general elections. I thought that, I don't know, in other countries, I'm not acknowledging every country in Europe, but there are laws against that. You cannot hold a referendum in the same day of the general elections.
We had a law against that as well, but because Orban, the Orban government is in 2/3 majority, so they have a super majority in the parliament. So if they think about the new, piece of legislation on Tuesday, they can probably introduce it by Wednesday morning. So this is what happened. Of course, I mean, this was, we had decent legislation as well, but not anymore. So yes, I mean, you are right. This is not a misinterpretation of anything. Yes, this is exactly what happened. So they had the idea about this referendum, and of course, it's very difficult. It's a challenge to have a referendum. To have referendum with valid outcome, because a lot of people don't bother to, these especially these questions, I showed you these questions, they are not exactly the ones which would mobilize you. Instead you would go on a Sunday, I don't know, to have I don't know, whatever you like to have on Sundays. But if you have general elections, of course, I mean, this is it helps you to consider these questions. And yeah, I mean, I didn't tell you the full story, because what was quite interesting is that actually there were like a few NGOs, including, for example, Háttér Society, the most active and oldest Hungarian LGBTIQ organization, together with Amnesty International, the Hungarian Amnesty, and they started a campaign weeks before the referendum, and they actually asked people to vote invalid. So it's, like both yes, no. And it was really quite effective because like more than 1.5 million people, you know, voted this way, but and also some people didn't even pick up the, you know, the referendum sheets, and then after the results, when it turned out that it is in fact legally invalid, the referendum, the National Election Committee actually took them to court, these NGOs, because, you know, they allegedly did something illegal, that they actually incited people not to vote, you know, not to cast a valid vote, which is, of course, it's nonsense, because of well, this was by voting consciously, you know, in an invalid way, it expressed, they, you know, a lot of people express their political views, and I mean, or well, whichever views they expressed, and so now this is the, you know, the most recent development, that they should actually pay a fine. But I think like 1 or 2 days ago, there was the High Court decided that not all NGOs will have to pay this, or, you know, I mean, there is, you know, there are some counterclaims, but still, I mean, this shows the situation of the Hungarian well, rule of law conditions. You can see, and these are perfect illustrations, I'm afraid.
And sorry, just the second question. But wait, actually, at the very end, what is a liberal democracy? It's really democracy, but it's another topic, really. How are the whole voting system is democratic or not? In liberal democracies, it's not really a true democracy, but this is another whole topic. So holding a referendum and the Senate general election is a whole thing, which is a little bit messed up, but I understand that, but it would be a different conversation about it. Thank you very much. My second question, I'll certainly go watch the TV series you have proposed, the Operation Hyacinth. Definitely could be very interesting. But my question is about when you talked about the LGBT free zones, it feels that how would you say if regionalism, for example, like bottom-up governance, do you think that it can help to change this particular topic in Poland, for example? Because you're saying that maybe from the top bottom, meaning state policies are very tight, but then at the same time you say there's these LGBT free zones that in different cities and different regions actually took a step forward, saying no, we doing the way we wanted to. Do you think that it could be like this state and this region? Like, do you think how to ask this question? Do you think that regionalism can help or not help into this change mentality, or to change the laws? Because actually you're saying that there are LGBT free zones, then other parts not, but it's different from what the state policies are. So do you think that helps or diminish? That was my question, because it doesn't seem to have a congruent policies on the top, but top bottom or bottom up. There would be, if I explain myself, maybe.
I mean, I think there's, I mean, the Polish ruling party coalition doesn't have the same sort of supermajority that Orbán's government has in Hungary. But nevertheless, they have a majority and they have a lot of support. So absolutely, it's very difficult to change anything at the national level. Again, there was hope at the last presidential election, the year before last, because it was the mayor of Warsaw, who was sort of very liberal, and he was sort of standing against Duda, who was the president, and it was very, very close. It was like 51 to 49. And if you look at any map of Poland, when it comes to voting intention, you can pretty much draw a line down the middle. I'm not very good. The western part is considerably more liberal, and the eastern part is considerably more traditional. And it's even more traditional in the southeastern corner. So geography certainly plays a part. I mean, there's a lot of arguments about, does this overlap with the previous sort of imperial divisions when sort of Poland was partitioned, whether there are sort of still sort of residual effects from that. But so I'm not sure that so local governments can't really sort of overrule anything that the state does if it's a sort of a law, but the sort of the big cities sort of play more of a role, I would say, than sort of some of the sort of the local communities. So I mean, I think Budapest is the only sort of liberal beacon in Hungary. And it's the same way that sort of Warsaw is a sort of a very liberal city, and some of the other big cities, Gdansk, are also sort of very liberal. The mayor of Warsaw introduced a sort of an LGBT charter, sort of saying that, if you live in Warsaw and you're LGBT, we will sort of respect you. And I mean, this was unfortunately used against him by Duda in the presidential election. It was really sort of made an issue in a way that it may perhaps not have been. But nevertheless, I mean, Warsaw is the best place to be LGBT. I did a lot of research on queer migration by Poles, and Poles either immediately left and sort of went to Western Europe, or first of all, they went to Warsaw, where things were considerably better than the regional sort of towns and cities. But even then, there were sort of limits. So they would often then go from Warsaw to London or Amsterdam. So the regional factor does play a role. But I think it's more sort of urban and rural, and then also this sort of southeastern concentration of traditionalism. But I wonder whether that's a similar story in Hungary, Judit.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and this is why okay. So I just wanted to add about the Polish, anti-LGBT or LGBT-free zones, that actually in Poland, there is still an ombudsman who can do things about these issues. Like, this is why I mentioned that, for example, in Hungary, there is, the Equal Treatment Authority was also kind of dismantled, which is, I mean, it was an important body which could represent, LGBT IQ people. And so I know about, a few cases, at least, when in Poland, the ombudsman actually, started cases again about the LGBT free zones. And also in the EU level, there was this, I don't know exactly the context, I can't recall it now exactly, but I think if you look into this, you will find that some of these regions who declared themselves LGBT free zones, they won't receive certain EU support, and these regional funds will be withheld for the time being. And I think this actually, when this was announced, a number of these regions actually reconsidered. So they are not so, they don't want to be so free anymore, it seems. So they can get rid of their LGBT free zones. So there are certain, ways to influence these decisions. And I think this is, in Poland, it's really great that you have internally as well, some still some fora remained, and I'm afraid that in Hungary we don't have so many options, especially because our institutional frameworks are quite, those which should protect minorities, they are quite weakened. So, well, it doesn't mean that you can't do anything, and I can see that a lot of activists are doing their best, and of course, researchers and journalists, they are doing their best as well to highlight these issues and collect data and to go on. But I think it's when I'm reading about these Polish developments, I can see that there are still quite a few options there. So I'm hopeful. Yes.
Just to sort of follow up on you're absolutely right. The EU did sort of stop transferring funds, regional funds, to these LGBT free zones. But then once the government in Warsaw heard this, they said, don't worry, we will replace whatever funds you don't get from the EU. Good for you for standing up for Polish values against EU liberalism. We will cover any shortfall. But even so, you're absolutely right. Some of them changed their minds, particularly when a lot of twin cities said, we're not going to be twins with you. We're not investing in you anymore. All relations will be cut off. But yes, absolutely. Poland always had a very strong civil society. You see when the abortion sort of protests, which were huge. The women's strike. Very, very active. And this, it slowed things down in Poland, but unfortunately, it didn't sort of get the government to change course completely.
The last question I wanted to.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
May I also ask something? I'm not sure about the Lithuanian situation, because we tend to forget about the actual first EU propaganda law which came many years ago. In 2009 there was also European Parliament not declaration, but how do you call it? Whatever. There was, in 2009, since 2009, there is very much Russian style propaganda law in Lithuania. So, how is it there? I don't know too much about Lithuania, but I should, keep asking. Perhaps someone knows about this. How it functions there, and why we don't know about this too much, or what happened in 2009. There was this big ooh, and then big silence. Yeah, do you know something about this, Richard?
Well, this is not something that the British should be proud of, but we had a law like that even earlier in 1988. We had this sort of clause 28. Which pretty much said the same thing. No public You couldn't present gay couples as a pretend family unit, I think was the wording. But at least, unlike in Russia, you could campaign against it. It resulted in Stonewall. And I don't think any legal cases were ever brought, but it was on the books. I mean, it certainly sort of stopped discussion in schools. But no, the Lithuanian one, I think because it's Lithuania and it's small, it sort of, I think, slips under the radar. It's not, I mean, if something happens in Poland and Hungary, it gets reported in the news across Europe, whereas Lithuania tends to slip under the radar, I think, a bit more. I really don't know much about it. I'm afraid, no. But
yeah, in any case, I think that the use of mechanisms of direct democracy in order to try to curb LGBT rights has been like a tendency throughout Europe, because we have seen it in Hungary, we have seen it previously also in Croatia, with the limitation of civil unions, I think marriage equality to same gender couples. And on the other hand, there was also this referendum right on same-sex marriage in Ireland that was kind of controversial because, in my opinion, it was putting human rights on the ballot.
Although I think in the Irish case, it was sort of procedural because it was in the constitution, and the only way you can change the constitution is by a referendum. But I mean, the activists sort of spun it and say, you know, we're the first to have actually voted in favor of this. Yeah, the Croatian case is interesting in that sort of the government, the political parties were not in favor of the referendum. They sort of campaigned against it, but it was, again, it was the Catholic Church. Because the Catholic Church and sort of family organizations, they saw that LGBT rights were sort of increasing sort of across Europe at the time, and that support for LGBT equality in Croatia was increasing. So they were worried that this is what would eventually result in. But yeah, the government was against it, which is sort of very interesting compared with other places where it's on the ballot, where, you know, in Latvia, they have this as well. Definition of marriage, Russia, and this was very much a sort of a top-down initiative, whereas, as you say, in Croatia, the government was actually opposed the referendum.
Okay, I don't know if anyone else wants to make a contribution. Otherwise, we're gonna leave it here. So thank you so much to our two speakers, to Professor Judit Takács and Professor Richard Moll. I think it has been like really inspiring, and I think your contribution will be useful for future generations of scholars that want to tap on what role does sexuality and gender identity have to explain our societies, our politics, and the socio-economic outcomes, right, that we experience. So thank you very much.
No, thank you for inviting me.
Thank
Thank you for the questions, Marina.